Stop the world!
So universities in Australia, in the US, and the UK, they need to go through and do a very clear housekeeping on what are their partners in China getting up to, and what are their own programs in China getting up to. Do they have any relationships with sanctioned entities or companies that are on a trade blacklist? Do they have any joint institutes with companies that are on a trade blacklist? They need to know very, very clearly what is going on.
Welcome to this special weekend episode of Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nilsson.
Recently, an ASPI team led by our head of China investigations and analysis, Bethany Allen, published a report on a joint venture university campus between Xi'an Jiaotong University in China and Liverpool University in Britain. Their findings raise some serious questions about research collaboration into sensitive technologies, including those with military applications.
In today's episode, Bethany talks through the findings, including the joint universities partnerships and close links with entities sanctioned by Britain, the US, the EU, and other nations for supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine and helping with China's military modernisation.
Bethany explains the risks that these partnerships create, how widespread they might be, and what more needs to be done by universities themselves by way of due diligence into their partnerships, but also the need for governments to set clearer rules and guidelines about what defines unacceptable risk.
Yes, importantly, Bethany makes the point that research collaboration is important for humanity and we don't want to choke it off entirely, but there is a need for de-risking so that innovation deriving from Western universities doesn't produce capabilities used by militaries of authoritarian nations like Russia.
Amazingly, the joint university includes a Centre for China-Russia Humanitarian Cooperation and Development. I chuckle somewhat because clearly China-Russia cooperation we always associate with humanitarian motivations. Anyway, it helps Chinese companies enter the Russian market and promotes research ties between China and Russia.
You can find this report on ASPI's strategist site, and we'll also link to it in your episode notes. We strongly urge you to have a read if you haven't already. For now, enjoy hearing Bethany explain it all.
I'm here with Bethany Allen. Bethany, thanks for coming on Stop the World.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you had a piece recently in ASPI's strategist. It was an investigation that looked into the relationship between the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom and a major Chinese defence university. It's a fairly complicated set of relationships, but Bethany, perhaps just to help our listeners understand, as simply as you can, talk through the chain of connections that you've identified.
Sure. So we're actually looking at three universities here. There's the University of Liverpool in the UK. There's the Chinese university, which is Xi'an Jiaotong University. And then there's a third university that those two parent universities created. It's a joint venture university called Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University. And we're going to refer to that as XJTLU. So XJTLU, it's a very large campus. It has around between 10 and 20,000 students. And this is the university that our piece looks at. And what we found was that XJTLU has a number of formal and official relationships with entities that are sanctioned by Britain, the US, EU, and others for either supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine or for assisting China's military modernization and human rights violations.
What kind of organizations are we talking about there that are sanctioned?
So XJTLU just last year opened a China-Russia Center on its campus. It's called, the full name is the China-Russia Center for Humanitarian Cooperation. And that center, let's back up a bit. Again, this is a university, XJTLU. One of its parent universities is a British university, and XJTLU doesn't issue its own degrees. When a student graduates from XJTLU, they're graduating with a dual degree, one from Liverpool and one from the Chinese parent university. So there's a very clear relationship here. And this China-Russia Center is the Russian co-director of the center, is affiliated with a Russian government agency that is sanctioned for its overseas influence activities and for its in support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And not only that, XJTLU welcomed a high-level Russian government delegation to its campus to launch this center. And that delegation was led by a former Russian senator who is herself sanctioned by the US, the EU, Britain, and others for her support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So you have this very direct kind of relationship with a sanctioned government agency and a sanctioned Russian individual. And in addition, XJTLU is a research university. It has a lot of focus on research in emerging critical and even dual-use technologies. And as any university in this space these days, it has a lot of partnerships outside of its own campus. And we found that it has an official partnership with a Chinese government supercomputing center that is sanctioned by the US for its support of China's military modernization. It also has a CHIPS school on campus that was co-founded by a Chinese government semiconductor research institute that is sanctioned by the US as well. And that CHIPS school, the top staff at that school have said that its aims are to design and manufacture its own advanced semiconductors. And, so the question here is about XJTLU. Is it breaking any laws? And we don't have an answer to that, but that's certainly a question. It's at risk. We can say it's facing a high degree of political risk. Mm-hmm. But also more broadly, if its parent institution, University of Liverpool, is supporting all of this behavior that potentially goes against the UK's interests, if it's helping China develop dual-use technologies, has there been a failure of oversight on the part of the UK government and also on the part of the University of Liverpool?
Interesting. Let's come back to that. I suppose that I can see it almost as two separate strands here. One is the work that is supporting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I mean, that is sort of self-evidently a sanctionable or a type of activity that obviously needs to be subject to penalties and restrictions. But then secondarily, there is collaboration that supports the strengthening of Chinese research and development in key strategic fields that the US, the UK, Australia for that matter, all agree that we should not be, helping China to build its capabilities in those areas, because ultimately that is going to be to our strategic detriment. So tell me if I'm thinking about this the right way. I mean, one overarching risk is that Liverpool University and hence the UK research community might be, for instance, providing intellectual property or helping develop intellectual property about those key security technologies. You mentioned dual use ones, for instance, or capabilities, ultimately to a Chinese defense university through its relationship to XJTLU, and through that collaboration, then strengthening military capabilities that China could one day use against its adversaries, including Western nations. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yes, that is. And you're right that there's kind of two separate strands here. However, in this particular case, if you look more deeply into it, and of course we did, there's actually a degree of convergence. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at the China-Russia Center, it's not primarily an academic exchange center. If you look at the statements of its Russian co-director, its Chinese co-director, and the statements that were made on its launch, part of its purpose is to help Chinese businesses, and particularly Chinese tech companies, enter the Russian market. And the Russian co-director is also separately, in a different role, he also is an advisor to the Moscow government, the Moscow regional government, and has also served in a similar capacity for the Jiangsu provincial government. And he's working on a project to get Chinese tech companies from the Jiangsu area to open an advanced technology development park in Moscow. And so if you look at the China-Russia Cooperation Center, it's very much in line with that, right? It's getting Chinese companies to go and enter the Russian market. Now, if in a different world, in a different geopolitical world, there would be nothing wrong with that. But Russia has been cut off from so much foreign direct investment and from so much of the international economy because of the heavy sanctions it has faced because of its war of aggression in Ukraine. And it has repeatedly and across many sectors turned to China to kind of break those sanctions, if you will, to have a market to go to, a market for its companies, and to have a way to access advanced technology and to have foreign direct investment in Russia. So this center is engaging in exactly that behavior, trying to get Chinese companies into Russia to kind of bring some vitality, back to the Russian tech ecosystem and back to the Russian economy. And in that sense, it's directly participating in Russia's efforts to maintain its resiliency in spite of all these sanctions. So it's not simply on paper that there are sanctions concerns here. It's that the very purpose of the center, you could say, goes against the entire goal of the sanctions and indeed the goals of Western nations at this time.
Yeah, I mean, even if you argue, for instance, that there should be limits on decoupling or de-risking from Chinese industry, the fact that it is so directly, in this case, flowing through to support for Russia, which is, here and now, right in front of us, continuing its war against Ukraine and causing enormous human suffering. I mean, it flies so obviously in the face of our concerns about, the no limits partnership between China and Russia, and the fact that China, as you just point out, is supporting and enabling Russia to continue the war that it might otherwise be struggling to continue, given how much money, people, and equipment it has expended on that war. So, I mean, are we just? Sorry, I'll let you talk in a moment, but are we just very, very fuzzy and muddled in our strategy on this? I mean, this idea of trying to put some constraints on things like the partnership between China and Russia, and trying to avoid things that empower them in their strategic competition against the West. Are we just muddled in our thinking on that? Or are we just not very good at then turning that into practical measures to actually prevent it from benefiting these adversaries or potential adversaries? I mean, is the strategy muddled, or is the implementation of the strategies not being done effectively?
Well, I think that there's a couple of different things going on. And one of them is that, universities like this joint venture university, it's China's largest joint venture university. It was founded in 2006. And that was a completely different time period. It was a different era. China was not such a security concern. It wasn't the main strategic rival of democratic countries. It was not nearly as developed as it is now. It was not a research leader. It wasn't, at risk of displacing the US as a top tech power of the world. And so at that time, there was this huge wave of optimism that China's system was opening up. This was before the 2008 Olympics. China's system really did appear to be opening up, right when this university was founded. And so there was the sense that the more that, Western countries engage with China, invest in China, open up, joint academic ventures with China, the more China will open up, the more liberal they will become, more democratic they will become. Of course, now we know that's not what happened. Xi Jinping came into power. He oversaw a hard authoritarian turn, and China also developed extremely rapidly, has become the top rival of U.S. Tech dominance. So what hasn't happened is that, what do we do with all of these research partnerships, with all of these academic partnerships, with these, the way that business has gotten all, intricately linked into these academic partnerships and into China's development? How do we unwind that? Should we unwind that? How do we start doing that? And a university like this, it's a multi-million-dollar endeavor. You can't just, it's not like a small company you can just close. And there's thousands of students who are involved. It's a huge campus. How do you, if you're University of Liverpool, how do you extricate yourself from that? So it's really a challenge. And then, the other thread here is a question of enforcement. So it was one of the big projects of people who work on China and work especially China and security in the past 7 or 8 years has been trying to get a kind of a sanctions regime around Chinese tech. We know that the Chinese government has supported IP theft to support China's development. We know that there's a lot of dual-use technologies that China is trying to get from the West or benefit from the West in order to strengthen their military modernization. And so now these sanctions and various kinds of export technology export prohibitions, they're now in place, but they're not really being enforced to the extent that they could be. And so there's a whole research ecosystem in China, and XJTLU is just one example of this, where you have these in some cases long-standing relationships with entities that then get put on some kind of a trade blacklist. Well, then what do you do? Another example is from our article is that XJTLU has a joint lab with iFlyTech, which is a surveillance technology company that has been, put on a blacklist because of its involvement in the human rights violations in Xinjiang. The ongoing genocide against the Uyghurs there. They're involved in that. So should they close their lab? I would say yes. But that's a fairly big deal. And also XJTLU, when it opened that lab with iFlyTech was not on that list. So it's not exactly their fault. And so you have relationships like that, just all over China with institutions from all around the world that are in this situation. And there hasn't really been much of a public discussion about what should we do about these.
So there's this Center for China-Russia Humanitarian Cooperation and Development that you've mentioned, Bethany. I mean, it's almost comical putting humanitarian in the name, but just tell me a bit more about the work that's doing and what, I suppose, some of the sort of practical capabilities that are coming out of that.
So again, China-Russia Center, it's trying to get Chinese tech companies into Russia. But something else that's interesting about it is that the Chinese co-director of that China-Russia Center is also a director of one of XJTLU's technology transfer centers. Now, okay. A technology transfer center, because the term technology transfer now has such negative connotations, and we think of it as forced technology transfer. So when Chinese companies or the Chinese, local governments, they kind of force foreign companies to hand over their technology to their Chinese joint venture partners. That's not what a technology transfer center does. It uses above board methods to facilitate technology transfer in legal ways. But the concern here is that if XJTLU and University of Liverpool have a very close relationship, which they do, and we know that professors from both universities do research together, and we know that University of Liverpool does quite a bit of sensitive or government funded research. They've gotten funding from the U.S., from the Pentagon. They've gotten funding from the U.S., from the FBI. In fact, they've gotten funding from AUKUS, research funding through AUKUS, I should say, for some sensitive projects, including, I believe, a project on electronic warfare. We know that University of Liverpool does sensitive research in areas that China would be interested in. And we know that they have a close relationship with XJTLU. So that raises a concern. Now, we don't have evidence of this, but we can lay out the ecosystem to say why it's a concern. There is a potential channel for UK government-funded research, paid for by UK taxpayers, to go through XJTLU into Russia through a center like this that is trying to get technology that Chinese companies have into Russia. Chinese companies are trying to get some of their technology from UK and other countries. So that is another concern here of that China-Russia center. And what that, emphasizes for Western partners of Chinese universities is that these days, not only are they facing a risk that their research could be, stolen or even if not stolen, simply incorporated into projects that would support China's, military or overall geopolitical power, but that they're now through those Chinese universities that there's actually a risk of exposure to the Russian market and to Russia.
I mean, that's it's an extraordinary, just practical example, especially, I think it was electronic warfare that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, the obvious application of that in Russia's war on Ukraine is enormous. I mean, I know Ukraine, for instance, is having to fly fiber optic cable drones so that they aren't vulnerable to electronic jamming. So there's just a really, really clear instance there of a direct risk that is being created. So what do you have thoughts on how we start to draw some lines on what actually constitutes risky collaboration? I think you mentioned earlier sort of possible failure of oversight by, say, the UK government, for instance. I mean, if we deem Russia a strategic rival and a potential near-term adversary, Russia clearly is an aggressor against its neighbours as we speak. I mean, there's an argument for stopping any kind of research and development cooperation with them in some way that helps them build their national power. But at the same time, we don't want to break the global economy by decoupling or heavy-handedly de-risking. What are your thoughts on what we need to do as at least as a starting point around some sort of public and political debate about how we define and isolate those things that need to be subject to research collaboration restrictions and things that ought to be able to go ahead and that we can say, okay, that's going to be reasonably innocuous going forward? I mean, do we just need to do a lot more work in that area?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to happen is that universities and research institutes that have some kind of partnerships in China, they need to do kind of a housekeeping where they go in and do their own due diligence. I mean, do their own kind of, Chinese language OSINT research. What are their partners getting up to? What are they doing? Because there's always these, new partnerships being formed. The Chinese research sort of environment now it's full of vitality. There's, a huge emphasis in China on a university research industry ecosystem. That's a term, creating this ecosystem. So there's always these new partnerships being founded and created. So universities in Australia, in the US, in the UK, they need to go through and do a very clear housekeeping on what are their partners in China getting up to? And what are their own programs in China getting up to? Do they have any relationships with sanctioned entities or companies that are on a trade blacklist? Do they have any joint institutes with companies that are on a trade blacklist? They need to know very, very clearly what is going on. That seems to be one of the top issues with XJTLU. It seems to me that they may have sort of, the left hand has lost a sense of what the right hand is doing. And I say that because, among other things, after our piece was published, the announcement in English on the XJTLU website about the founding of the China-Russia Center, that was taken down. So somebody realized, in a way they hadn't before, that this was problematic. And you can't really do anything until universities know who they're partnering with, even if, removed by 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And then what needs to happen is, as you said, a public discussion about how much risk is acceptable risk. Where do we draw that line? Because if you try to, this is generally true for national security. If you try to eliminate all risk, bring it down to zero, you're going to be losing so much in that pursuit that it's going to harm more than it helps. And I think we're in the same kind of position here. We're not at a stage where we need to cut off all research ties to China. But I think that there is a place where you should say these kinds of technologies are very sensitive. These companies, we need to stay away from them. And I think that governments need to make it very, very clear where that line is. If a Chinese company like iFlyTech or some other is put on the U.S. Commerce Department's BIS federal entity list, governments around the world need to make clear what that means for their own universities. So a question is, I believe it's Oxford. I think they state clearly on their website that they do not partner with companies that are on U.S. blacklist or sanctioned list. They don't do that. I don't know that they're legally required to not do that, but they know that they might lose access to some U.S. funding if they do that. Governments need to help universities understand what is the legal environment that they're operating in and what are the government's recommendations. Do the governments recommend that universities cut off ties to companies like this and entities like this or not? Because universities aren't necessarily equipped to make those decisions themselves. Universities don't have national security councils. They don't know. They can come up with a list of entities they're partnering with. That doesn't mean they know what to do about it. So that's where the role of governments come in, to put regulations and to say, hey, we've done the work for you. We have the resources to do that. Here's our guidelines.
And when it comes to doing the due diligence, clearly universities have absolutely no excuse not to do that. You are a formidable China researcher, if I may say, and you have a great team under you helping you with that work. But you alone have managed to identify a number of very problematic linkages and entities that are either sanctioned or entities of concern for one university. So really, there's no excuse for universities not to be able to do that open source due diligence themselves. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. And again, a lot of this was in English. Yes, I can do, fancy Chinese language research, but that wasn't even necessary for most of this. Some of it was just in English on the university website itself. This was not rocket science. This was very easy. So as you said, there is no excuse for them not to know what's happening in their own house.
Yeah. And you can treat this either as a comment or a question and respond accordingly. But adjacent to what we're talking about here is the fact that the US has just announced that NVIDIA can once again sell its H20 chips to China, the very powerful chips that are good for training AI models and for using for AI inference. It does sort of feed into a picture that there is diminishing rather than increasing concern about collaboration. Look, the US, I think Howard Lutnick said, well, these aren't the best chips NVIDIA has. They're only the third best or the fourth most powerful or whatever it is. That might feel a little bit more reassuring if this change of policy was part of a defined policy and strategy, but instead it seems to be part of a deal to do with critical minerals. It's essentially part of a transaction. And so, I mean, I don't know whether you have any reflections or not, but it does sort of feel as if there is broadly, a lessening of the concern about collaboration, either in research or development or in, things like export controls.
Yeah, I mean, I think my view on this is that, either we're serious about the reality that semiconductors are the key to the future. They're the key to future economic and geopolitical power. Either we're serious about that or we're not.
Yeah. Yep.
And letting, NVIDIA, again, have permission to sell its chips in China would be a big step back in the work that people have done to try to try to be serious about that. We're very late. We should have been doing this 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah. All right. One more question to wrap up. Your work here this is one Western university, in this case, Liverpool University, that you've identified. It's open source research. As you say, a lot of it was in English. It's there if you know where to look. Now, obviously, we don't know what we don't know, and at the risk of sounding Rumsfeldian, there are unknown unknowns here. But, what are the chances that this is the sort of tip of an iceberg here? If you went looking and you found one extremely egregious example of it, is it possible that there is a huge iceberg sitting beneath the surface here that if people actually start looking, that they will identify pretty quickly?
Well, yes and no. So in terms of joint venture universities or the kinds of joint venture institutes, there's a fairly limited number of those. There's not thousands of those. There's not even hundreds. So looking at that particular kind of problematic, potential for problematic relationships where you have, an entity in China, a university that is actually part of a British university. There's not a lot like that. There's Duke Kunshan University. There's University of Nottingham, Ningbo. There's I could name 6 others. Not a ton. So from that perspective, this exact kind of problem, there's not a lot of them. However, there are, if you want to broaden it to other kinds of relationships, company to company relationships, or Western universities having relationships with Chinese companies, Western companies having direct relationships with Chinese universities or research institutes, definitely tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm. Or even researcher to researcher, right? There are either researchers or small teams of researchers who are collaborating in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that the researcher to researcher, or just people collaborating for one paper or one project or one something like that. I think that's the hardest to try to manage, because that's the level of scientific cross-border scientific collaboration that you don't want to quash. That's kind of the bread and butter of the vibrancy of science. And if you try to control it at that level, I think humanity would suffer a lot. And I think that probably innocent people would get, caught up in things that are not really their fault. But I think doing it, if you can, I think on an institution to institution level, looking at companies, looking at research institutes, I think that's a more realistic way of going after it. And so you don't have to create basically a research surveillance state. You don't want to do that. You want to create guidelines and structures to get rid of some of the most egregious things without trying to micromanage everything.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point and an important, I think, lesson for people to remember. I mean, a complete bifurcation will likely only sort of harden adversarial positions. People-to-people links do actually matter. And as you say, there's a lot of innocent, positive collaboration that is actually going to help humanity overall. And we don't, terrible cliche, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All right, Bethany, look, that's been really fascinating to hear about. I urge listeners to jump on The Strategist and find the piece that we've been talking about here. It's by Bethany Allen, Danielle Cave, and Adam Ziogas. So it's a fantastic piece and well worth a read. Bethany, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks so much, David.
That's all we have time for, folks, on Stop the World. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode next week.